Let's start with clarifying something. As I understand it, there are two different actions being taken here, and I can say one is inbound and one is outbound. One is specific to Huawei and one is more general. Could you explain those two actions?
Surely. The one on Huawei is essentially putting them on the entity list. That means that for anyone to ship product or software or services to them, they would need a special license from Commerce Department. So that's outbound material from U.S. Separately, there was a presidential executive order setting up a procedure for supply chain management in terms of telecom, and that encompasses the inbound part. That one will take some time to set up. We have been given under the order 150 days for Commerce to come up with the detailed regulations for implementation, whereas the order dealing with Huawei itself will be effective tomorrow.
In terms of selling things to Huawei, that could be effective tomorrow, as you just said. To what extent can Huawei turn to alternatives, particularly Nokia and Ericsson, for example, to buy some of the things they otherwise would be buying from Qualcomm or Intel?
Well, I think a number of the things that they now buy could be replaced with third parties. I'm not sure that it would be necessarily the third parties you mentioned, but there would be some potential replacements. That would probably involve some re-engineering, maybe some redesign. So it's not necessarily a seamless or immediate transition. But a lot of the material they could probably design around, either with third parties or do some work more internally to Huawei. Huawei has quite a bit of technology itself.
So if, in fact, Huawei can find other ways of doing this, there may be some adjustment, as you say, some time, some difficulty, they can adjust to it. How does it protect our national security interests to cut them out simply from U.S. suppliers?
Well, it protects it in this regard. First of all, it's not certain that they will be able to find replacements, or if they do, will the replacements be as good as the U.S. equivalent? Will they be as economical? Will they have the useful life? All that. So I didn't mean to sweep with too broad a brush in saying that for many of the items they could find a replacement. Whether they could find a replacement for all is another whole question, and that's one that you'd really have to ask Huawei about rather than ask me about.
So, Mr. Secretary, we've had some experience before with ZTE, when in fact they were essentially shut down, and then they came back in and said, if we make some certain changes, including, as I recall, the board of directors and pay a large fine, some other things, will you let us back into business in the United States? What is the goal of these actions? Is it to get Huawei to change its behavior? Could it come in and say, we'll do things differently and therefore be able to buy, for example, semiconductors as well as sell some material into the United States? Or is this basically, we don't want to do business with you?
Well, ZTE was a bit different in that ZTE was the settlement of a court litigation. This is not settling litigation with Huawei. The litigation brought by Department of Justice, the indictments that were announced a couple of weeks ago, remain. So does the extradition request for the chief financial officer of Huawei, who right now is in Vancouver and is subject to what amounts to house arrest, pending the determination by the Canadians as to whether they will accept our extradition request. So they're in a little different circumstances.
So to my question, I understand they are different. You're quite correct to point that out. To my question, though, is there anything that Huawei, or for that matter, the Chinese government could do to come into your office tomorrow and say, we want to really fix this. We want to fix this in such a way that Huawei can buy, for example, semiconductors from the United States, as well as sell things into the United States. Is there anything they could put on the table that would get your interest?
Well, that's really quite a hypothetical. In general, we're always receptive to hear ideas that will accomplish the same purpose. The purpose we have in mind here is we think there is a significant danger to national security and to our foreign policy of the existing situation at Huawei. If there becomes a different situation, obviously we would be fact-based, but I don't mean to imply that this is intended as the beginning of a negotiation, simply trying to answer your question.
Thank you very much. This is Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross. We're on Bloomberg Television and on radio. Pursuing this a bit further, Mr. Secretary, have you thought, has the government thought through possible actions the Chinese government may take in retaliation? Because thus far in the trade negotiations, we've seen it's been a little tit for tat. What could the Chinese government do, and how much damage could they do to U.S. companies and U.S. business?
Well, this is not really a part of the trade negotiation. This is an enforcement action brought by the Bureau of Industry and Security, which in turn is part of the Department of Commerce. So this is not actually a part of the trade situation, and it was not something that had been discussed in any of the meetings, the many meetings that were held between China and the United States.
I understand, and it's been clear that the United States from the beginning has said this is national security, this is not a matter of trade negotiation. But when we hear from the Chinese, they certainly put it in terms of their understanding it as part of trade. And even if they think it's national security, they can take reciprocal actions. What if they took reciprocal actions to sort of ban, for example, Apple from China, not selling into China, not buying things from China? Or for that matter, put a ban on U.S. companies buying electronic components from China, including things like lithium-ion batteries, which they have a pretty substantial market share of.
Well, the Chinese government has to decide what course of action they wish to take. All we can do is react to whatever it is that they undertake. I'm not aware of any action having been decided just yet by the Chinese government, so it's a little hard to speculate what they might do, and even harder than to speculate what we might do if they did take some action.
Have you had any dealings with the Chinese government on this subject? That is to say, in advance of the actions taken, to talk about what's going to happen, or since the actions were taken, any response directly from the Chinese government? Are they talking with you?
The State Department notified the Chinese embassy here of the action we were about to take shortly before we took it. The only responses of which I'm aware are those that have been reported publicly, and those were very generalized responses.
Mr. Secretary, you made it clear this is not part of the trade negotiation, hasn't been raised in the trade negotiation. At the same time, you've been very involved in the trade negotiation. This can only complicate that process, can't it? Even if it's not on the table as part of the negotiation. Is this likely to make that more difficult and actually extend the negotiation further?
Well, again, it's hard to speculate, but certainly behavior of which Huawei has been accused in the Justice Department indictments and in other situations relating to other countries, certainly that kind of behavior is the kind of behavior that the trade negotiations are hopefully going to mitigate. But whether they will deal, I doubt they will deal specifically with Huawei as an individual entity.
Mr. Secretary, Huawei, as I understand it, does not sell that much into the United States. They buy a fair amount. They don't sell that much in. But they do sell some 4G equipment into particularly some rural telecom companies here in the United States. Is there going to be any differentiation in the way you administer your rule about selling in the United States? Is there going to be any differentiation that will give some relief to some of those rural telephone companies?
Yes, we do have a plan for providing a degree of relief for the rural area broadband companies. The big companies here, the major telecoms, really don't use Huawei equipment anyhow, so it's more the smaller rural ones that are at issue. And for example, we already will have in place for the first 90 days, they will be able to do what they need to do for maintenance of their equipment. And we will be having discussions about narrowing somewhat the potential of the list in order to minimize the impact on those rural companies.